And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful, and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth.
This video is going to cover the last 2 days of creation, that is Genesis chapter 1 verses 20 to 30, with text from the King James Version. So let's get stuck in. Let me start by a quick edit here. If I simply blank out some lines, I hope that I can show that we again have an element of creation by divine fiat, or God speaking stuff into existence. I'll come back to the detail in a moment. And if I flip the edit, we have the Sabbath edition. That is, God actually doing work to create stuff and then resting, which supports the priestly imperative of the Sabbath. Of course, simply blanking out lines does not reconstruct any purported original texts, but I hope it gives you food for thought. One other initial thing to ponder here. On day 5, God creates everything in the sea and sky. On day 6, God creates everything on land, including mankind. Now, does that make you feel special? I would have thought that God making all the animals on one day and saving mankind for the last day would have better shown how important we are supposed to be. But I suspect it was more important to fit the creation into 6 days so the priests could have their Sabbath. Anyway, let me walk through it verse by verse. Verse 20. Nothing too exciting except to point out the separation of firmament and heaven here, backing up, I hope, what I've said in previous videos, which is in contrast to the Ken Ham creationist interpretation that they are one and the same thing. Verse 21 is simply repeating verse 20, but now with God doing the work. And he sees here that vultures, eagles, sharks, and all the other flesh-ripping creatures are good. But we also see here the first mention in the Bible of the word kind. The creationists love to play with this word because they think it gives them the latitude which allows them to argue that Noah's Ark only needed to carry an owl and a pussycat to repopulate the entire earth after the flood. But the creationists have a problem. And that problem is Leviticus chapter 11 verse 22, which is telling us what is good to eat and what is bad. Now, I'm not big on bush tucker, but the first thing to say here is that a beetle is not always a beetle. It is now generally accepted that beetle here means cricket. The Jewish Torah translation of Leviticus states, you may only eat members of the red locust family, the yellow locust family, the spotted grey locust family, and the white locust family. So in this one line of the Bible we can see that kind is much more specific than those pesky creation peddlers would have you believe. The locusts that can be identified are all in lower subdivisions of the Acrididae family, which comprises some 10,000 species. Crickets is a family of its own. So perhaps the creationists need to redefine kind, or at least you should take them to task on it. On to verse 22. Here God does his Dr. Dolittle impression and talks to the animals. Go out and multiply, he says. Let's think about that for a second. In the cartoon world of creationists, there was no death, and no death planned. Introducing Mola Mola, the ocean sunfish. Now these grow to an average adult weight of 1 ton. And the female lays 300 million eggs at a time. Let us say that they only spawn once a year, so that after a year there are 300 million of them. And let's say half of these are female, and that those 150 million new females spawn after, let's say, 2 further years, and they produce this many eggs. And after 2 further years, half of these new female mola mola spawn another this many eggs. How many? Well, that's 1 times 10 to the 32 eggs, each growing into an adult, so that after just a couple of years we will have over 1 times 10 to the 32 tons of sunfish on an Earth of total mass 6 times 10 to the 21 tons. Does anyone see a problem here? Now, imagine the effect that mice and locusts breeding uncontrolled would have on the local grain supply, and the absurdity should just about start to take shape in your mind. But pressing on, seas, plural. Why plural? Well, it's been argued that this was another attempt to diminish anything which might be considered anthropomorphic. You'll remember that the sun and moon don't get a name. So maybe this is there to suppress the old gods, because sea, singular, is Yam in Hebrew, and Yam was an old sea god. And there is an interesting aside here. Yam appears in the Ugaritic myth of Baal. In the myth, Yam is god of the sea, which is important in Ugarit, which is on the Mediterranean coast. Baal is the storm god, important for the rains and harvests. And El is the lofty supreme god. Now in the myth, El changes Yor's name to Yam. There's no convincing argument that Yor here has a connection to the short form of Yahweh. Yam is sent off to fight Baal, the storm god. Initially, Baal bows to Yam, but then defeats him. And this can be seen as an explanation of the seasons, with Yam, the raging sea, ruling over perhaps the winter, and Baal subduing the sea and providing the water for the crops in the spring. If we search the Bible for Yam, sea, we can see several allusions to the sea as an anthropomorphic entity, in Job and Psalms especially. And we can imagine a mutatis mutandis comparison, highlighting the fact that the Israelites used the same basic mythos to construct their own mythical history, albeit dictated by their unique circumstances, as in the Exodus in Isaiah 51:10, where Yahweh tames the water to allow the Israelites to escape Egypt. On to verse 26. Let us make man in our image and after our likeness. Think about that carefully for a moment. This us and our business. It's argued that this is the Holy Trinity at work, but in reality, the Holy Trinity is a Christian invention. Nowhere is the Trinity mentioned in the Old Testament. Had it been so important, Moses might have let a mention of it slip out. But when Christian fathers were trying to make sense of their muddled beliefs, they quote-mined and backward engineered the Old Testament to try to justify their interpretation, fought over it for a while, and then agreed. Of course, they were not above tweaking the Bible to support their view, witness the forging of the Comma Johanneum. Now, when you consider here that our image and our likeness are quite specific, and the next verse states that male and female were created, how do you reconcile that in your mind? And remember how God is described elsewhere. This God walks, talks, rests, smells, he has feet and hands. It's hard to come to any conclusion beyond that which the Bible clearly states, that humans were formed in the image of God or gods, meaning that the God or gods look like us. Anyway, verse 27. If there were any confusion, it's restated just who created what. And in case you did not know, man here is a translation of the Hebrew word Adam. And having just created humans, God now speaks to them. So God had pre-programmed them with a complete vocabulary and the ability to comprehend what he was saying and the background knowledge to interpret his words and understand what they meant in context. They've learnt nothing. They just magically know. There's a computer programming maxim, garbage in, garbage out. You do not blame the computer when it makes a mistake. You blame the programmer or engineer, which I may come back to later. And finally, God saw not that it was good, but very good. Now, bearing in mind that this omniscient being would supposedly know everything that was to befall his creation, it sounds to me like his standards were not set very high.